Okay, we are recording.
Okay, so this was going to talk about Corona Futures Day, or this is Kyle and Youst asked me to do this, and this really comes out of not from answers of what's going to happen or a set of scenarios we developed about Corona Futures, but an interest in trying to move forward of how to think about this and how to maybe use this platform and this Slack group to do something interesting. And I guess Youst is interested in this, and Jonas, who I saw here, is interested in this. And so I'm going to present sort of a bit about myself and who I am, how I'm kind of thinking about the Corona crises, talk a bit about the Seeds of a Good Anthropocene project that I'm involved with Youst and a whole bunch of other people. Some might be on the call, Laura or anyone. And then thinking about some ideas about how to navigate or create Corona futures, and then have discussion. And Kyle asked me to talk for about 20 minutes, and hopefully I'll be on time for that. So me, I'm a professor in Sweden, but I'm originally Canadian. And I have a kind of, as probably many people in this group do, have a bit of a weird background I did an interdisciplinary engineering program where I kind of focused on sustainability and complexity and at University of Waterloo. And then I went on to work do my PhD with Buzz Holling, who was a guru of resilience and adaptive management at the University of Florida. Ended up getting a PhD in zoology. Then I worked at National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis and a Center for Limnology in Wisconsin before becoming a assistant professor in geography and at the interdisciplinary school of the environment at McGill before we're coming over here to be a professor in sustainability science at the Stockholm Resilience Centre, which is a fairly large, about 150 people, sustainability hub focused really on biosphere-based sustainability. And I work a bunch, or have continued to, on ecosystem services, regime shifts or ecological tipping points, what people actually do with kind of resilience ideas in practice. And then these two activities that are more related to my interest in Corona futures, the Seeds of the Good Anthropocene project. And I'm a member of the IPES, the UN Global Organization for Thinking About Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, their task force on models and scenarios. And we're working to try and develop a new set of global scenarios for nature that, unlike all the existing ones, would actually be about positive futures for nature, be cross-scale and pluralist of thinking about different values for nature. So that's a bit where I come from, especially with thinking about, for the IPES stuff, how can we kind of intelligently deal with coronavirus and that in our thinking. So, and thinking about coronavirus as a systemic risk is kind of where I start. And coronavirus is, some people say the President of the United States, it's like no one ever predicted this. But of course, as probably most of you know, many people predicted exactly this, and things very similar to this have happened multiple times over the last few years. And coronavirus is, I think, widely seen as being something that the humanity has taken up a huge part of the biosphere, and our agro-ecosystems have become entangled with wild systems, where our agrosystems, as showed by the figure on the left, where of mammals, us and our animals make up most of the mammalian biomass in the world. So if you're living on other types of mammals, you have lots of opportunity to meet people or the things that we eat. And then the world that we're living is this kind of more complexly entangled world in all sorts of novel ways. But the complexity of our institutions and organizations has not aligned to match up with these increasing connected risks. And the figure on the right is from a over 10-year-old paper, which was talking about looming global scale failures and missing institutions, which I think is
Garry,
a big
I may be the only one, but I still see your intro screen. I'm not sure if you're the only one.
Sorry?
Yeah, likewise here. So
I still see your first slide, so I don't see the slide.
There we go.
Okay.
There we go.
Oh,
yeah.
no.
Yeah.
Okay, so this maybe works better?
Yeah, we're fixed up now.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe full screen it. I don't know if that's possible.
Yeah, no, that's what I went away from, was the full screening. So
yeah, full screen doesn't work. So
yeah, okay,
okay,
so
good
that's
stuff.
what I was doing. but hopefully this is okay. So this is the figure on the left saying that mammals are dominated by us and our agricultural friends, and that the world is increasingly complex and connected, but our institutions haven't matched this. And despite people being really concerned about this for a long time, if anything, the kind of complexity of global organizations has been fragmented in recent years since the 2008 crisis, where, as you see, this kind of very difficult response in the unwillingness of nations to work together and to collaborate with the World Health Organization. And part of, I think, a problem with this is sort of an idea of what dominates a lot of the ways people think about the world, or organizations think of the world, is this kind of taking a linear, fragmented view of the world, where the idea is, well, if you do something, everything's individualized, people are acting by themselves, actions have immediate consequences that rapidly fade out over time and space. And that's often true, but in a more complex world, you can have consequences and impacts that occur years and thousands of kilometers away from where you started. And as probably all you're aware, this is kind of things like how people living in the Arctic are full of persistent organic pollutants like PCB and mercury that they never produce, but are transported there from industrial activities around the world and then concentrated up food chains in the Arctic. So in this kind of complex connected Anthropocene, a lot of the ways that we think about things are not well suited to some of these new types of challenge. And this is how I'm thinking about Corona Futures, is from this kind of resilience thinking perspective, which is sort of saying, well, resilience thinking is there's lots of things in the world which we can control and we understand really well. These design systems, you can optimize them, you can have better broadband coming into your home. It's all designed. But when you have these situations which are poorly understood, uncertain, and difficult to control, that's where we need more kind of complexity or resilient type thinking. And I'm mentioning this because I think this is useful for thinking about the coronavirus and the responses, and therefore how to think about the future of it. And in resilience thinking, I like to kind of distinguish 4 different kind of flavors of resilience thinking, depending on whether people are thinking about how they themselves are going to be navigating through a system they're part of, or how you're analyzing something that's separate from you, and whether you're looking at it from a structural perspective or from a dynamic perspective. And from resilience research, people have identified a whole variety of structures to deal with things. So say, just up at the top here, enhancing polycentric governance. That's kind of this claim of this, the previous thing I was talking about, missing institutions, saying there weren't enough connections between various institutions and not the appropriate multi-level aspect. Similarly, oh, thanks, I get some coffee. Similarly, these ideas of making sure you get disparate sources of knowledge and disparate types of knowledge to discuss complex systems, versus approaches that are focused on, say, system structure, where you're concerned about functional resilience, response diversity, and connectivity that shapes how systems respond, to approaches that allow you to navigate over time, such as thinking about learning, experimentation, having complex systems understanding embedded in organizations, and managing both slow and fast processes. So those are a whole bunch of resilience principles that you can kind of both see that there are aspects of those in some of the coronavirus response, and other ones that have their lack has led to a lot of problems. So then you can also kind of think, as I was saying, that the coronavirus isn't a black swan, it's basically only a light gray one. And it's from all kind of large scale environmental assessments have expected that we would have more of these types of crises, not necessarily just pandemics, but situations where there's some new complicated surprises emerging from novel interactions between people and nature. And this could be like the Australian wildfires or something like that as well. So just these things that are occurring in new ways, new places, and at new scales. And not totally coming from me, but for many people, there's people wouldn't agree upon these lists, but I think there's quite a bit of consensus of through these kind of surprises, there's futures that people want to avoid. So if we're thinking about the future, there are places where we don't want to go, and there's futures we want to pursue. So I would expect that many people on this call would be sort of opposed to authoritarian nationalism, global fragmentation of this kind of closing borders and having a relocation in nations, kind of a gray, a concrete and oil oligarchic stimulus and response in, to try and recover from the coronavirus, and the regulation and control of nature versus looking after nature. And along with that, kind of this idea that the failures of the coronavirus response were that we weren't certain enough and we didn't do things the same. I'm speaking from Sweden, where we've had lots of international criticism for not doing the exact same thing as many countries in Europe have done, of like locking down schools. And I'm sure everyone is familiar with all the amateur armchair epidemiologists who have been, I think, overly trusting and naively interpreting very different data that's been reported from many different places. So I think those are kind of futures to avoid with the coronavirus. And there's futures to pursue of having more resilient, connected societies that are able to support one another and support the most vulnerable in those societies, able to cope with shocks without having massive disruption happen to them. That there be more global partnership of people supporting each other, countries supporting each other in their response rather than closing borders and hoarding supplies. That the chance of recovering from the coronavirus could potentially accelerate a transition towards sustainability, of changing the way people live in cities, reducing reliance on fossil fuels and accelerating movement to clean technologies and more sensible transportation options. It could promote the stewardship of nature, and it could promote adaptive learning and situated practices that are responding to the complex world that people are living in. And as I say, this is sort of my version of things, but I think if you've been reading about what futures people hope for or want to avoid from the coronavirus, I think these are themes that have come up in many of the pieces. So where to go from here? So as I mentioned before, I and Joost and many others work on this Seeds of the Good Anthropocene project. And I think that's a useful way of thinking about the coronavirus. I'm going to just talk about that a little bit now. So Seeds of the Good Anthropocene project is partly based on the idea of where the good Anthropocene comes from, is that by many of the ways people think about the future are dystopic. Almost all popular imagination of the future right now is dystopic. It's hard to think of, there's only a few books, movies, video games that imagine some kind of sustainable future and a pathway of how we can get there. And these bad Anthropocenes, I think, colonize our mind and make it more difficult to think about how we could change the world we live in today, which is in some sense a bad Anthropocene, to move towards a better one. And that's really what we're interested in, is trying to think about how seeds, things that exist today, of a better world can grow and thrive together to build this better world. And by imagining how that could happen, you can help make it happen in reality. So what we mean by seed is a way of thinking, of doing an institution or technology that actually exists in the world in some way that's semi-stable, that is marginal. It's not full grown, it's not a dominant thing, but it has the potential to grow. And according to someone, it contributes towards creating a sustainable future. And we've been very interested in trying to think about really different types of seeds that not everyone would agree with, that they're positive, but they have some goal of changing things to create some kind of more sustainability. And just on the bottom of the slide, showing a few of the ones that we like or so about. One is about working with poor marginalized people in India to establish commons to institutionally look after areas that are degraded while restoring those areas, so to improve people's ecological livelihoods and the means to control access to that livelihood. The restoring green areas and making walkable spaces what I call natural spaces in dense urban areas, like the river restoration projects. Providing backups of global seed banks by creating a global backup of seed banks in Svalbard, or tribal parks that have been created in Canada where Indigenous people have asserted their rights over Canadian land to establish new forms of governance. So those are just some examples of things we've been interested in. And we've used our own types of scenario methods, which have been based on these kind of amplifying weak signals methods. We've done something called with future wheels from this Manoa method to try and imagine how seeds could grow into the future and what their first order, second order, third order effects could be, how they could interact with one another to develop emergent futures and look for tensions and synergies there. And then use this other framework from futures, the Three Horizons framework, which is about thinking what would have to change for these seeds to grow. So we identify some seeds, think about how they could grow to create a more sustainable world, but then what aspects of the current world would have to decline to enable that to happen? And if that was happening, what kind of conflicts would exist? And what sort of enabling conditions would have to exist in the world to enable these seeds to thrive rather than being destroyed or co-opted by the dominant world? So why I am talking about this is I think this type of approach could be useful for thinking about or exploring good corona futures. And I think a way of how I see this, at least, is like the world we're living now has lots of wealth, but is super unequal, unjust, and ecologically unsustainable. We have these paradoxes of more people are better off than they've ever been, but we have both lots of people being overnourished and malnourished at the same time. And even in our very globalized world, where people are born dominates what can happen with them in their lives. And all this meanwhile, we're undercutting the living world that supports all life on Earth. And this presents all this kind of turbulence. So if positive things coming out of corona futures, we have to imagine them against this background, and how could they thrive in this background and move this background towards a better world? So then, what am I thinking? So I'm thinking with this group, we've got a kind of at least sort of globally distributed group with quite a lot of diverse knowledges and backgrounds here, a lot of skills in thinking about futures. And as far as I understand, Joost is actually running a course where he's going to have some students exploring these kind of issues. So it's a lot of different types of resources.
Yeah.
And I think it's really interesting to think about both big scale possible responses, but I think it's a lot more, and bottom up ones. But I think focusing on the bottom up is a lot more grounded. It's where usually people have a bit more expertise and where we can make more of a difference. And I think we could try and think about what are existing potential initiatives, either things that existed before coronavirus that could shape the response, or things that were done in response to coronavirus that could grow to create better futures. And an example that I was thinking of, and apparently other people here, Jonas was thinking about as well, was this one. Many cities around the world are temporarily closing streets to give more people more space to walk around where they lack parks or other areas they can go when they're supposed to be socially distancing. And Milan is the first city, I think, to announce that they're going to do this and making it to a permanent feature of the city. And I think this kind of thing of kind of connecting an immediate response to a longer term change to address air quality, access, the livability, and the fairness of the city are really positive responses. Just connecting with the Seeds project a bit more. So one of the things we've also been doing in the Seeds project, we've done a fair bit of work on collecting sort of databases of seeds. And that's in this figure, just kind of showing an example, but where we've actually kind of coded these databases in various ways. And we tried to connect in some of these issues to what kinds of different types of environmental problems are addressed, and what aspects or traits do these seeds have in terms of what transformation theory would expect or predicts would enable them to more successfully transform. So I think that's something that's also very interesting to connect to scenario thinking is, can you think of some different things and identify the ways in which they could interact, and what are the things that would particularly enable them to grow in different types of environments. And then with this, you could think about doing things like I was mentioning with the Seeds project, of doing these kind of future wheels. On the left here, I have an example from a Swedish futurist who's just speculating on his blog about first, second, third order effects of the coronavirus. But you could think about this with different initiatives like we've done with the Seeds, and think about how these could play out over different horizons in the future. And I've also thought that some of the ways to do this, I'm not really sure, and this is what I'd like to open up to discussion now, basically, is that how we could we collect seeds in a database? I know Jonas is a bit interested in that or started doing that. Could we collaborate to create scenarios or mash things up with one another? I've been interested in this platform, All Your Ideas, which is kind of a wiki survey thing where you can use to kind of evaluate and sort and add new ideas together. Or in the same way we're having a little webinar today, we could think about doing virtual scenario workshops. I actually did with European colleagues about 2 weeks ago. We did a 2 half-day invasive species scenarios in Europe workshop. Or we could simply just have some reflective webinars which think about different features. But I think thinking about corona futures and trying to apply some of the different futures methods that people in this group have worked with be a really interesting thing to do in this group. And I would like to hear from other people now what they think about things and what ideas they have to do it. And just to finish up, I ended here with a quote from Rebecca Solnit, who is our kind of patron saint of the Seeds project, of that all this turbulence, it doesn't mean we're going to get good outcomes, but it gives space for at least trying to create good outcomes. And I think it's for researchers working on sustainability and futures, this is a time when we should be trying to do something that's useful for the world. And you can find out more about me or the projects at the Twitter and the website I've stuck on there. And I guess we'll share this at the goodanthropocenes.net or SeedsGA, which is Seeds, and I'm Resilient Science. But with that, I'll try and close my PowerPoint and unshare my screen if I can. And I don't know how you like to do it, Kyle.
So,
but we could do questions and comments if I can just.
Yeah.
Oh, there. Okay, there I'm back. Okay.
Essentially, if anyone wants to speak, please use the hand icon at the bottom left of your Jitsi screen, and I'll call your name.
Yeah, and if no one immediately has a pressing question, I would maybe suggest that Jonas and Just say something, because we've already talked a little bit, and I know Jonas is interested in thinking about collecting initiatives, and Just is interested in Corona Futures.
All right.
So they can maybe start off with some of their ideas.
Yeah, Jonas, please go ahead.
Yeah, just to explain a little the activity I tried to initiate, and that has been running for a couple of weeks. At first, what I think I identified as a key challenge is the fact that we are having this sort of discursive battle around what those futures might be. And so you see all those different claims around this and this will happen, all kinds of forecasts and all kinds of claims, op-eds to abound. But in general, they tend to be quite, to some extent, almost aligned with what people are already thinking before, right? So you have a transportation researcher that has been claiming that more bikes are needed, and then you'll say like, oh, this will happen because, And I was trying to get a bit to see the various claims that were being made and perhaps start noticing what would be the most relevant narratives that are emerging. So I proposed that to a group of people, and we formed a kind of Slack community that is connected to the anticipatory governance to try and look at some of those claims. And I'm back, and Marta, who's just turned on her video, is also involved in that. So we have, I think, been having some difficulties in kind of really mobilizing the group of people that initially suggested. I think everyone is kind of still figuring out how to work with the current situation. So it hasn't been the easiest or the most effective group, I would say, so far. But I think the central idea remains a good one, and I was perhaps trying to explore ways to either realive in that group or find ways to collaborate with perhaps other databases that already do something like that. And what we were trying to do, just to explain, is to, in a spreadsheet, basically try to decompose the claims about a certain future in the corona in terms of what are the disruptions or problems that relate to it, what are the features of the response that might be driving some of the changes, and try to identify some of what are the mechanisms that they're claiming. So, for example, experimentation with new features or possibilities to concretize something now that wasn't possible before, and so forth. What are those mechanisms, and what are the kind of futures that they seek to do? So I can tell you more if you're interested, but just to give a glimpse of that. And Marta, feel free also to tell us from your perspective how that initiative has gone, if that is useful.
I just woke up, so I'm just here to listen for now.
Yeah, maybe I can take over, Jonas, from you to, as Garry suggested, to talk a bit about our course. So, I'm running a course together with colleagues at the Copernicus Institute on global transformation pathways, and we've been doing this for the last couple of years. And the seeds approach that Garry has talked about has been central to this course. But this year, because of the being in the middle, or probably at the beginning of this pandemic, and everything that comes out of it, we are focusing the pathway development with the students on these questions about how do we create these sort of seeds-based transformational future pathways, both at the global level and at the national level. And this is actually something we're doing at the national level with policymakers and other stakeholders from 30 different countries. So they're working directly with people from all these different countries. The students are also encouraged to engage with global experts and societal stakeholders also on the global pathways. There will be symposia about the pathways that they're developing, and it's in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals. So they'll be sort of framed by different combinations of goals and then building these pathways. There are more than 100 students who will have a lot of pathway exploration happening based on seeds, and they will be using sort of the corona pandemic as a sort of landscape context. And Garry, and Jonas, and Laura Pereira will also be part of the lectures next week. And I would encourage everybody who's interested in this and getting in touch to get in touch with the students to just get in touch with me on Slack or on Twitter or email or whatever, because they could really use your input and would be very interested in that. And there's a lot of work going into that, and especially given the fact that they'll also be working on national analyses across the world with all these policymakers. It's not just a course, right? It's a global project in a way that you have a chance to connect to if you'd like. So, yeah.
Garry, would you like to sort of add on to that?
I don't think I have so much to add other than just I think it is. I fully agree with Jonas, and maybe I would have emphasized that a bit more. I think that this kind of a false certainty is the last thing that we want right now to kind of navigate through this crisis. And I think trying to look at all these different kind of narratives or propositions about what could happen is interesting, but then also I think that combining them together can be very interesting to kind of see what kind of novel things could come out. And with this kind of future wheel idea, I think that's kind of a bit of a thing. I think you could kind of even think with that of like, well, if something like that would happen, what would be some of the other consequences? And does that still make sense? And I think you can also kind of combine that with these types of three horizons types of thinking of, well, how could such a possible transition actually take place? The one other thing to add is I think one of the things I'm particularly interested in, and we have been with the food project, Seeds project, is with food. And as people probably know, food system has been hugely impacted by this crisis, both in terms of maybe that obviously restaurants have been super affected, but then also logistics has been one of the things in which is still operating, but has changed. And then with farmers, it's food producers, it's a big impact in the supply chains. And we've actually been asked to try and do some stuff of looking at these kind of Corona food futures here in Sweden. And we're still trying to work out some details of how we would do that. But I think that kind of more thematic focus could be something that'd be very a way to kind of energize things if there were some people who were already working or connected to some specific issues like food or climate adaptation or urbanism. I think that could be an interesting way to move forward.
Fantastic, and the work that our students will be doing will be thematically diverse as well, so it can connect to that. And I just wanted to say that Jonas' sort of interest and Martha's interest and others to sort of map these different kinds of accounts and different mechanisms that they're talking about, sort of that are out there, will also be using this input into our work with the students. And I think that sort of typology type approach would be super useful. I guess, Garry, you've probably already posted a future wheel somewhere on the Corona Futures chat, but I'll take a look at it because that looks really interesting. Future wheel.
Yeah, I stuck that future wheel in my talk, but I think that's more, I thought it was actually kind of a nice example of how you do a future wheel, but I think exactly. The consequences are not surprising to anybody, is what you already know, right? Because he just said coronavirus, right? And so it's the things that we're all living with now.
Right.
But I think what would be more creative or interesting is to do some future wheels on some of these responses and thinking about how they could go forward. And this is one of the methods that we've done in the Seeds. And I think we found this, and lots of people use it because when you're doing it for things that are a bit more specific, it often ends up being quite an interesting tool to get people to generate new ideas. And then we've done this kind of combining them together, which people often find difficult at the beginning, but then after a little bit, usually becomes quite productive.
All right, so we have some hands up. We'll go to Alana and then Manic and possibly Jonas after that.
Okay, thank you. Hi, I'll introduce myself quickly because I don't know people very well. My name is Alana and I'm part of the Slack group through Brendan Mapes. I work at the OECD, so I'm part of the Strategic Foresight Unit at the Secretary General's office. So very interested. Thank you very much for the presentation. I just wanted to mention a couple projects that I'm aware of that seem sort of in line with what's being discussed in case you would be interested. One of them is the Bright Spots project, which one of the collaborators on Seeds of Good Anthropocenes. I'm a huge fan of that project, by the way. I know Tanya Hitchert from South Africa, and so she's involved in that one. And then another one is the Next Generation Foresight Practitioners Joseph Jaworski Award group. We're putting together, I'm involved in that one, we're putting together a kind of futures manifesto, but it's really more from a kind of like personal futures perspective. That one's not public yet, but I'm happy to share it. And then there's someone else in that group who's putting together a kind of database really more focused on kind of alternative positive narratives that more in the kind of arts and culture space. But he's also been playing with this idea of trying to figure out how to structure a database, and might be an interesting person to connect to. I'm kind of limited in what I'm able to do because OECD kind of locks their staff in contractually, but like to keep on top of what's happening. And likewise, just to support Jonas's comment about the kind of predictive discourse that's really quickly emerged, like exploded out of this. So we're at OECD really focusing on making sure that directorates and policymakers are keeping in mind how much uncertainty there is, and then also using a kind of futures wheel type methodology to spin those uncertainties out into possible implications, just to make sure no one's making any erroneous assumptions, but hoping to move on into those more second, third order possible impacts eventually. So thanks very much.
No, you're welcome. And of course, I know Tanya's project, which is kind of, I guess, inspired a bit by the Seeds project, but is especially trying to connect to people in school in Africa with these kind of positive narratives. But it'd be cool to, I just Googled about the next generation foresight. And I guess one of the things that we've been doing is we've been trying to kind of do questionnaire type things to code things. And that's something, it often takes quite a while to get the right set of questions. But if you get some good questions and a guide, you can kind of pretty transparently code a lot of things. And so that's something that we've been doing both with the Seeds, but it's been inspired by work in more looking at practice stuff and working with people. But I think also this kind of trying to connect this more work on transition or transformation to scenario practice is very useful, or something people should be trying to do.
Okay, Manic, please go ahead.
Hi, so thank you for the presentation, Garry. I don't work with some of the food and other based, like more tangible things that everyone else, a lot more people work on. But I mean, since the pandemic and before, I have been very concerned with the fact that when we take on anything, whether it is working with governance and food systems, or whether we're looking at political work, whatever it is that we're doing, there's a lot we miss when we design experiences around emotional well-being and basically mental health when you are dealing with large transitions, when you are trying to get people to change behaviors and attitudes around a certain issue. So I've been circling around that general area, but based on either one topic or the other. And now with the pandemic, one of the things that's coming up is trying to look at playable experiences that
Oh, we've got a technical issue. Just wait here. Hopefully, Manic's internet comes back. Hello, Manic?
Yeah, is it better?
You're back. Okay.
I don't have the best system right now where I am temporarily either, so sorry about that.
That's okay.
So briefly, it's like I'm interested in looking at when you look at sowing seeds of future attitudes and behavior, I'm interested in looking at how we kind of understand what needs to change in whatever project or process, what needs to change, and then trying to understand how to build that kind of supportive system within projects. So if you're asking a lot of people to change a certain type of usual behavior, whether it is how they grow food or whether it is how they just care for themselves and their children during lockdowns, whatever it is, like what are we building to help people cope? So that's kind of just where I was coming from, and where I was curious about the tools we can use to do that and what happens within the use of tools. So just sharing that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I can maybe
okay.
just
go ahead, Garry. And
okay,
then
sorry. No, use can go. Yeah.
Yeah, just that reminds me, Manic's comment reminds me of another project that I just wanted to mention. We have a new Horizon 2020 project called Creatures, the best name ever for a project, and it's a project on how creative practices contribute to transformation. And actually, because of the onset of the pandemic, a lot of the we have a lot of creative actors and sort of design studios involved in this throughout Europe. But of course, things have changed a lot since the pandemic. And so the project, and because the EU and the European Commission has encouraged all Horizon 2020 projects to think about how they can use their project activities to help with the pandemic. Actually, one of the things that we're doing is collecting practices that people are setting up as a response to all kinds of issues that relate to the pandemic. So we're developing a database, and we're developing all kinds of analysis around specifically how creative practices of all kinds are, functioning in a way as sort of seeds that come springing up as a response to the pandemic conditions, especially both the socioeconomic but also the psychological and community aspects of the mental health aspects of the pandemic. So I just wanted to mention
that. Monique, do you have a response, or move on to Jonas? Oh, I think that's an internet thing. Okay.
Looks like it, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Just give it a moment. Okay. Jonas, please go ahead.
I just wanted to comment on Gary's point about the possibility of using something like the future wheel, or especially the multiple ones, or the questionnaires. I find both ideas super attractive. I think one of the challenges of any databasing around Corona is the fact that there's multiple simultaneous crises happening, right? So you have everything from all sorts of disruptions in multiple systems and so forth, and including the economic system and so forth, and that brings in this kind of conjunctions that are hard to navigate. So I really like this idea of using multiple events almost as a kind of trigger to think about the kind of second and third. So that is definitely very powerful. And I imagine that once you identify some of those third order, or responses to those events, then something like the questionnaires can be really useful. So yeah, I'll be keen to explore more how that can be used.
Sorry, you need to mute myself.
I see Carla is raising a hand.
Oh yeah, sorry, that was my mute. Carla, please go ahead.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. Yeah, I've also joined the Jonas group, but I haven't been able to do anything because I'm guilty of same thing everybody's going through. Too many things happen. I feel like of all this, and it was mentioned before, is that people tend to reaffirm especially people at high level, to reaffirm what they already thought. Like you have all these economists thinking of what is going to happen, and they just say what they've been saying for so long. So I was wondering how useful is that, and how we could actually connect to the actual seeds, as you call them, like the bottom-up initiatives, and where are those? And so I was a bit, I have no answer to that, but I was thinking like all this sort of grassroots initiatives that are happening with artists, where they just kind of take ideas of random people and start collecting them, and they made like little YouTube, videos and things like that. And what is it? I don't know. I forgot the name of this actors that are doing the good news and stuff like that. It's just things that people do, and it's not the opinion of somebody. So I think there's value on the database of like media and more structure, more like thinkers information. But I was wondering, maybe it's also interesting to explore in this, given these conditions where we're sort of trapped in our houses, how we could engage with the actual seeds.
Yeah, if I can just say, like, what we've done with our Seeds project is a little bit of a mix of, we both kind of collected seeds that we've never met from secondary data to kind of people that we've heard about, and then we've interviewed them. But in our actual scenario workshops, we've actually done the workshops with people from the seeds there. So we've usually brought together people from a bunch of different seeds that usually don't know each other. Some of them might know. So say, like, when we were doing Stockholm region food seeds, some of those people know each other because it's Stockholm. But in, say, with youth, we did these like Northern European scenarios here in Stockholm. And there we had people from UK, Spain, who didn't know each other. And that's one of the things that's actually, I think we're really excited about, for kind of trying to promote change, both with the people we bring, but also to try and make change more credible by getting different change makers or people who are trying to do things together, compare their experiences and see how they could work together. And for these kind of more distant people, it doesn't work so well. But for places like around Stockholm, it's like very useful, because you're giving people a platform to kind of get to know each other and think about the future and explore ways they could work with people who have slightly different goals and different initiatives, but there's a lot of potential. So, and then I mentioned before that we're kind of trying to do some Corona response with food people. And so literally, I was just thinking of exactly the same thing. How are we going to do this with food people? Because you can get some people, like everyone here, can be on a Zoom call, but generally chefs don't do too well in like workshops or something unless you get them to make some food or something. So often when you do workshops, you want to do something embodied in the world of walking around or being in someone's workplace, and doing everything so abstract like this is maybe good for very abstract people who work abstractly, but not for lots of people. So I think that's a challenge. But fortunately in Sweden, we are allowed to be outside our houses and with other people, as long as we're like physically distancing from one another. So I have to think about that. But I think it's really good to try and engage with people who are actually trying to do things and learn from their practical experience.
Joost?
Yeah, just a quick comment to sort of reinforce Gary's point there. We also did a seeds project in Kyoto with Astrid Magnus, a PhD researcher on our team, and Kyle knows about this because he was there at the time as well, that we were doing these kinds of things. So basically, what was interesting there is we used seeds methods with various kinds of sort of futuring approaches, including gaming, and we did a sort of like a role-playing game where we used the different seeds that we were working with, along with a new form of governance that people in Kyoto, this was sort of Kyoto food system that they weren't really familiar with, which was a food policy council. And what was very interesting is that we used seeds from Kyoto that people sort of knew about and that they actually represented, but maybe they didn't know each other's activities. Then we used other seeds from Japan, from elsewhere in Japan, and then we used seeds from the global database. So people were learning about each other's work. They were learning about stuff that was going on in Kyoto, elsewhere in Japan, and sort of elsewhere globally to get inspiration from other parts of the planet. And then combining that with letting people practice with a new form of governance that could actually be organized was very useful. Because they got some experiences and practice with this food policy council, which after the event, people started talking with the local government, with the city council, about actually establishing that. So that's just another example of sort of empowerment locally, and with when you're working actually with people who are part of these seeds. Yeah.
All right. So I guess to get to Carlos' point a little bit more, I wonder what we can do to promote these kinds of exercises, given the social distancing that we all have to experience, especially those of us who have stay-at-home orders. Here in Calgary, we have a very interesting situation because we have stay-at-home orders. Generally, the outbreak is still very much happening here. We get reports of new sorts of work sites that are sites of outbreak, often due to cramped working conditions. And the city budget is in a shambles because the price of oil is tanking. And obviously, Calgary is one of the most oil-dependent cities in the world in terms of it's all the head offices of oil in Canada. So we're very much in need of different futures because we're in crisis, but we're also stuck at home. And maybe I am more connected to y'all than to people in Calgary because I'm part of this global network. But then I can't go and meet people in the city here, so it presents very interesting challenges to kind of develop seeds in this situation.
Yeah, really good point.
Yeah, so I don't know. Maybe I don't know. I guess some things that come to mind is to maybe use like the local Reddit. At least in Calgary, this is a very common place for people to talk about their home city, or to try to get the word out on Facebook about these kinds of things. Someone had their hand up. Joost, please go ahead.
Yeah, just quickly, I think that the local Reddit made me think of having a sort of like seeds-based game streaming, a streaming channel on Twitch or something, right? It could actually be interesting, like a sort of serious game streaming channel for just streaming a bunch of games, like once a week or something, just playing something, doing some seed stuff, doing something else, and getting attention that way could be interesting, right?
Yeah, definitely. I could absolutely see that being a good way to go. I think another thing I see a lot from game streamers these days is that many of them are posting people who are normally just streaming games, commercial games for entertainment purposes. They are going through many of these sort of mental health crises that Manic was bringing up. And so maybe, doing something that is like quote unquote serious games or this Corona Futures related gaming could help them to be both, contributors to that imaginary, but also like help them get away from just feeling like, oh, I'm so isolated. I'm just sitting here playing games, and this whole crisis is going on around me, and that sort of mental health crisis. Joost, please go ahead.
Yeah, to quickly bounce off of that. So it's maybe good to know that Kyle and I are part of a project called Anticiplay, which is about games and futures. And we should maybe think about something like this, Kyle, as because we also have to redesign our project like everybody else.
Yeah. Manic, please go ahead.
Just adding to just Kyle, just a side note. What I was. I totally hear you on that, and that's what happened in the project that I was working with, is because I was trying to look at this.
Oh no.
Manic, we're having more internet issues, but if you turn off your video, maybe it will help get the audio across.
Okay. I'm gonna turn it off and go downstairs where it's better. Okay. Yeah, I'll say, is it better now?
Yes.
Maybe. Okay. Yeah. Right. So I was just saying that. So at this moment we're kind of pottering around trying to figure out
how can a playable format not just be an escape, but also be a way to touch onto what you're saying, Kyle, is like, I know this is happening. It's not just escapism that I'm playing, but how can the various playthroughs somehow either give me ease my mind, or else look at different ways I can cope with this complete uncertainty of this scenario, even if it means playing through something that some part of your life you can control. So this is like very early stage for me too, and I've never made a game that is a framework for collecting someone's thoughts and feel like attitudes and beliefs around that. But yeah, so
Yeah, absolutely. I think I've seen a number of journaling games in the tabletop role playing game space that may help with that. So I think that might be a direction to explore because it is easy to for everyone to participate in that on their own time. Like I used to do a journaling game on the train to work. It was playtesting for someone, so that might be one way to go. All right. So I think we may be kind of coming up on time here. Garry, do you have any concluding words to say?
I think not so much. Maybe two things. One is I think like going to continue. I've just been kind of sharing a bunch of the kind of Corona futures that come up on the Slack, and I think there's quite a lot out there because there's not just people speculating on their thing, but there are all sorts of things about narco traffickers having a hard time of it versus other sorts of unexpected things, which I think are interesting just to kind of think about. But on a more other thing is that I think many academic, I think Just and Kyle and Jonas are all like ahead of the curve a bit, but I know at like the Stockholm Resilience Centre and with the Resilience Alliance, we're all trying to basically organize some more online engagements, which are not necessarily directly with the coronavirus, but I'm kind of thinking about how to think about moving forward. And so I think there's going to be more of these kind of platforms that people can find out about it. I know we're planning to do some stuff with the Stockholm Resilience Centre soon. And I will share those things when they come out, of just sort of more reflecting of thinking about what can some resilience thinking principles be used to kind of move through and forward from the coronavirus in some of the multiple ways we've connected, but connecting to many of the research that's ongoing there from both the governance to the Earth system science perspective. So I hope to move forward with these things, and I think there'll be, I'm sure, more interesting talks here, but we can also share, or I will share some of the other ones that are coming up soon. And thanks for having me.
Of course. Thank you so much for presenting. Thank you everyone for participating. Those links will be in the video description below, so you can check out further information from Garry there. And thank you for watching, everyone who's catching this after the fact.
Thanks, Kyle.
Sure thing.